Welcome to another edition of Focal Point. I am the host, Chris DeBoer from Reform Perspective Foundation. And today joining me is John Vorhorst, a financial advisor and owner of CV Benefits. Welcome, John.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And it's really good to see you as always, Chris.
Yeah, the feeling is mutual for sure. Our hope today is to discuss some of the financial implications of COVID-19 and the loss of jobs. The economy has taken a hit for sure, and the government has responded. So the response to COVID-19 by our governing authorities has been to, first of all, enforce social distancing policies, and then consistent with that, they have closed all non-essential businesses, causing many people to be laid off. In order to address the impact of COVID-19 on the health sector, as well as the financial concerns of families and of businesses, the government has developed a number of major spending initiatives while the economy is struggling. So today, with John, we are hoping to discuss some ways that individuals and families could respond to the current situation and then prepare for future challenges like this. And in addition, we want to discuss how small businesses can or even should take advantage of opportunities presented by the government. So that's the plan for today. So, John, when we think about the economic impact of COVID-19, let's first consider how have the markets responded to the government plans and to the economic downturn?
So initially, of course, as we likely know, Chris, when it became apparent how serious and how devastating COVID-19 could be, all markets worldwide responded in a very, very negative way. So we saw a very rapid collapse in the equity side of things. We also saw some interesting things happen on the bond side of the market. The last week and a half, 2 weeks, we are watching the market try to respond in a positive way to lots of the government intervention or the government's assistance to businesses, to individuals. Governments worldwide are doing their best to provide cash for people to continue to live. They're doing their best to provide what we in the industry call liquidity, because without liquidity, of course, everything seizes up. The concern that I have is that even though the last week and a half, we are starting to see some small improvements in the overall marketplace, the concern could be or should be, can this be sustained? So when we look at the fact that places have been closed down now, businesses have been closed down, here in Alberta for 5 weeks now, what are the long-term ramifications to that closure? And so those are the concerns that we try to talk about with our clients, and those are probably some of the concerns that we all have. One of the other, or maybe the most important thing that we should remember, Chris, is that when a pandemic like this hits and when financial markets go through this amount of turmoil, human nature sometimes takes over, and we have what could almost be called an irrational fear. Maybe that's too strong, but there's a lot of fear in the marketplace. There's a lot of fear in the business community. I would imagine there's a lot of fear in people's homes. And from a financial perspective, we need to remember, and we need to remember this not just financially, but in all of our lives, that especially financially, because that's what we're talking about today, that the money, the finances, the businesses that we're talking about, these are all God's gifts. It's God's money. Ultimately, God is in control, and we should always remember that not only is God in control, but God will continue to look after his children. So try to remember that even when we might be very afraid and very concerned, we need to go back and trust and rely on God, who has looked after us already for generations. And so he will continue to look after us through this time as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that when we talk about our finances today, we're talking about stewardship given the context in which we find ourselves today.
Right.
Right. So how we react, how we respond, what we think about, all needs to be done on that basis of faith and knowing, indeed, like you said, that God is in control. So it's not fatalism, but it's trust. Right. And I think if we trust the Lord, and we act to the best of our ability with wisdom and responsibility, how the Lord blesses that, how he uses that, we have to trust him with that. John, there are a lot of people who have been laid off. A lot of businesses have been closed. A lot of workforces have reduced their sizes. So the government has set up some personal opportunities, right? So people can apply for an emergency fund to get $2,000, I believe, a month. That's taxable. And I understand, if I understand correctly, you can still earn $1,000 as well. So you could get up to $3,000 a month and have that money there. Would you recommend that if you've been laid off, even if you have the funds in your bank account to do without them, should people who are laid off go and apply for that money and use it and use it with wisdom and stewardly, or should they wait until they absolutely need it? And then a follow-up to that, John, should we even take that money? Should we not just rely on the deaconry and on the brothers and sisters in Christ to help us during this challenging time? So kind of a two-point question there.
That's a really big question, Chris. And I have had opportunity to have just a really broad-ranging discussion with a few people about some of these issues. I think that if we keep in mind that God is in control, God is directing events around us, God has placed government in the positions where these governments are. So in Canada, we have a federal government that has various programs in place, including a $2,000 support for people who are not able to work because of COVID. There are small business loans of $40,000. There was an initial 10% for small businesses. They could reduce their payroll tax by 10% of their salary if they without really any requirements. There's a 75% payroll subsidy that government has announced. For that, of course, you do need to meet certain requirements. So two questions. Should we use those? Should we avail ourselves of those supports that government has put in place? In a big picture sort of way, I would say yes, we can use that. We are allowed to use those resources. Always remembering that those resources are there as God's gift to us. This is the big temptation that is out there, is that we also will become, like so many people, become or come to the conclusion that government is the one who will provide for us. So remember, government is not God. Our God is God. So as long as we remember that God is God and he is in control and he directs also government, and when government is willing to supply support, then yes, we can accept that. So now the second question that you asked, which you asked first actually, should we accept that money today, or should we wait until we are in various serious financial situation? I'm recommending to my clients to accept that money right away. And sometimes clients will say, or some clients will say, well, I don't really need that money, John. There's a $40,000 small business loan, for example, or a $2,000, this $2,000 support. I have enough savings to get through 3 months. I don't need that money. My response is, if the government is giving you this money, I think you're allowed to look at it as a gift from the Lord. Always remember, this is God's money. It's not your money. It's not the government's money. It's God's money. And now use that money in a stewardly way. So if you don't need the money, give it to someone who does. There are still, and maybe more than ever, countless people in our communities who are not able to make ends meet, who do need help financially. If you don't need the money, give it away. Nothing wrong with using the gifts that God has given you. As a matter of fact, I think that's what God requires in His Word. Use the gifts that God has given you for the benefit of our neighbor.
So if we can, so on a personal level, if we've been laid off and we would qualify for that emergency fund of, let's say, $2,000 a month, you would recommend take advantage of that, see it as God's providential care. So there's an opportunity for us to take these funds and to use them probably more stewardly than our governing authorities, and use it for good, right? So certainly not, the idea is not to take that money and then spend it unstewardly or spend it on some of the extras, but to take advantage of the opportunity to use that for good. Is that a fair summary of your point?
I think that's very fair, Chris, and yeah, absolutely, that's very fair. Yep.
Okay. Then if I can just touch a little bit on the role of the Ministry of Mercy and the deaconry at a time like this. This is probably a challenging time for church members and also for deaconry to A, be aware of who's out of work, B, maybe the deacons need to learn how to apply for these things to help people who are out of work, and then C, how do we continue to feed how do we continue to support the deaconry when we are not gathering together? So it's a bit maybe off the financial industry part, but I do think it does touch on the response of Christians during a time like this. Do you have any thoughts, John, on how we can help the Ministry of Mercy be effective at a time like this?
So that's a really difficult question. So if you ask me, how can I help the Ministry of Mercy, I would answer that a little differently. So because of my experience in this industry, then what I have already done is I've advised, I've called up the deacons in our church, or one of the deacons in our church, and I've suggested to him that the deacons should become very aware of the programs that are there, and they should advise people to take advantage of those programs. So even probably a more controversial aspect of all of these programs, which is not a government program, but is something that was put out by banks early on, is a deferral of your mortgage payment. So if you have a mortgage and you're not sure about the stability of your job going forward, is it a good thing to defer your mortgage for the next 3 months or 6 months, whichever bank you're dealing with and at whatever level? Should you defer the mortgage? And so I'm suggesting to people that yes, you should defer the mortgage. And again, the obvious statement is, I don't need to, I have the money. Yes, you have the money today, but will you still have money 3 months from now? You don't know what will happen 3 months from now, and you don't know if banks will be in a position to offer that deferral 3 months from now. So take advantage of it today. If you don't need it, every mortgage that's written in Alberta allows, and across the country, allows you to make a lump sum payment once a year at 10 or 20 or 30%, depending on the wording in your mortgage, of the original amount on your mortgage. So you can put that money back. It costs you nothing to do it. So those are some of the ways that we can help, that I can help deacons, is by providing that kind of advice. How do we help deacons broadly? I think that the deacons are doing a good job in, what I've seen is making people aware of ways that they can continue to contribute to Ministry of Mercy that's required everywhere in the country, and to do that electronically. Some of us that are a little older are not as conversant with how to do this electronically. So, if deacons can learn how to do the same as we're doing today, sharing a video, you're very able to share your screen with somebody. So you could teach me by sharing your screen. You could, in effect, teach me how to use a banking program to continue to send money to places that need money. So I think those are things that deacons can do. They need to become very conversant in today's electronics and computer technology. Not very, but yeah, maybe more conversant than what they are. And maybe I'm not being fair to them, because most of the deacons are younger, so they probably have every bit as good idea how to do that as you do. So it doesn't really answer your question, how can we help? But I would say that there continues to be opportunity, and don't be afraid to look around for those opportunities. I trust that deacons would be calling to see who does need help, but that's a challenge as well.
I think your first point, I really appreciate that. The deacons need to inform themselves, to become aware of the government programs and the bank programs, so that they understand opportunities that they could provide to those who have lost jobs or who have some challenges. And even a podcast like this, hopefully the deacons can hear that and then be reminded of the opportunities that the government does offer, and to not feel guilty about taking advantage of those opportunities, because maybe there are some deacons who would hesitate to give the kind of advice that you're giving. But perhaps now we've put a pebble in the shoe, as it were, to help them to rethink how to take advantage of government programs. John, then if I think about that other loan you mentioned from a small business perspective, so I'm not sure what constitutes a small business, so perhaps you would know that better. Is the opportunity there for all small businesses, despite whether or not they are essential, to take advantage of the $40,000 loan, and what kind of conditions are on that loan?
So the three different points. Small business is generally defined as having less than a payroll of a certain size, or less than a certain number of employees. But for this program, the government has very clearly laid out which small business is eligible. So there are only two requirements. One, you need to have a payroll of somewhere between a minimum of 20,000 to a maximum of 1.5 million. 20 or 25?
I think it's
let
20.
me just look. 20,000 up to a maximum of 1.5 million. So as long as last year, the last calendar year, that was your payroll, then you're eligible. The other condition is you need to be registered with Revenue Canada. You must have a CRA account with Revenue Canada. So you must be a registered small business, right? As in my business, I have employees. I'm required by law to withhold tax off of their check. That tax money I have to send on their behalf to CRA. So as long as I have those two criteria met, then I am eligible. There's no other criteria. That's the only criteria on that loan. Now, inside of the documents, the government does require that I use that money for ongoing expenses. one of the ongoing expenses is the expense of my payroll. The other would be the expense of utilities, property taxes. If I have a mortgage, any mortgage payments that I'm making. But the first point is that you must have a payroll between 20 and 1.5. So if I have that kind of a payroll, then even if my payroll was only 20,000, the first 20,000 I'm already using of that 40 I'm already using to maintain payroll. And of course, once that money is in my bank account, whatever money is being, nobody's tracking, that particular dollar anymore, right? So I can easily demonstrate to government that I'm using that $40,000 to continue to pay my fixed expenses, as they would call them. The obvious intent is that I don't lay my staff off and have them become a burden that way, but I keep them on and then use that $40,000. And behind your question is an obvious question. What if I'm in a position where I don't need that $40,000? I'm really, really fortunate. I'm in a business that is considered, first of all, essential. Secondly, hasn't to this point suffered very much through COVID. So our business doesn't really need that $40,000. So should I still avail myself of that opportunity? And my response to people when they ask that question is, yes, I should still take that $40,000, apply for it, and use that. And because it's $40,000 that I can use interest-free from now until December of 2022. And even if I don't really need that money, I can now use that money again to help other people who may be in a much less fortunate position than I am. So there are small businesses, especially individuals who are not organized as a business, but are just a proprietorship. So, a plumber working out of his basement or a carpenter working out of his garage. These people are not eligible for this $40,000, and they may not have any work. So now, as small business, I can help some of those people either use that money as a gift to them, or but again, always keep in mind that it's God's money. Use the money in a way that glorifies Him, not use it as a way to accumulate for myself, right? Part of that program, the interesting thing in that program is if at the end of December of 2022, I can pay the loan back, then I only have to pay back $30,000 and the other $10,000 is forgiven. So now I have a $10,000 gift that I can use, I can distribute to various charitable organizations. One of the things that we need to think about is what happens tomorrow, what happens next year, what happens 3 years from now. Those are difficult questions because we have no idea. Maybe somebody out there has an idea, but I have no idea how this pandemic and closing down businesses for as long as we have, what will that do to the overall economy? So we don't know that. We don't know what kind of financial pressure that will put on families. We don't know if families will be able to pay their fees to continue to operate Christian schools. So now if I have a $10,000 gift in 2022 that I don't need, I can send that money to my local independent school right here in Coaldale, or if Coaldale doesn't need it, but somebody in Ontario does, I can send it to a school in Ontario. So again, I can use this money that I believe God is providing for His people. I can use that for good to continue to support godly, godly organizations, godly functions, and particularly Christian education. I think is going to really. That's my fear, is that the economy, the economic downfall or downturn is going to be so great that it's going to put a lot of pressure on our young families, a lot of financial pressure. And so businesses like myself who don't need that $10,000, we can use that money to help out in education in 2 years' time.
Would it be wise to so if I don't need that money, would it be wise to take that money and invest it in short-term investments? I'm thinking here of, I mean, GICs are not high interest, but they're low risk. What would you do with that $40,000 if you don't have a need for it today? So you wouldn't necessarily give all $40,000 away. So what would be a stewardly way of using that money so that when the time comes to pay it back, you can, but you've also made good use of that money while you had it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we are doing is we're just tying that money up in short-term instruments like a high interest daily interest account. So you can still earn, just under 1% in something like that today. You could invest it in a 1-year GIC, which would pay, very similar to that. If you wanted to be a little bit more aggressive, you could invest it in a various ETFs that have very low cost, like a bond ETF, or some financial instrument that is tied to Canadian banks, perhaps.
Could you tell us what an ETF is?
Oh, ETF is an exchange traded fund. So it's a manager pools all of our money and tracks a particular financial instrument. So sometimes they're tracking various banks, sometimes they'll be tracking blue chip companies, sometimes they're tracking just dividend paying stock. An ETF is a higher risk than a bond fund. A bond fund is a higher risk than a GIC. A daily interest, of course, would be the lowest risk. So, be careful when you're investing that $40,000, because you don't want to be in a position where you don't have the full $40,000. If you don't use it at all, you want to be able to pay it back. So you don't want to lose any of it. You don't want to be in a position where you could lose it. So be very careful how you invest it. I personally would have a hard time recommending to someone to invest it in anything other than just a GIC or a daily interest account, because the objective should be that you have that money available in case someone needs it. And if you put it in the market, now you're limited, you're potentially limited to when you could take it back out to help someone. So you should stay as liquid as possible with that $40,000. So when someone comes to you and says, Chris, I need some money, or here's an organization that we really need some money. Can you help us? Do you know anybody that can help us? You can just immediately write a check for $10,000 to help them. And, I think that's the way I would look at it. But
would it, when you think about that $40,000 in the payback system, so if I understood you correctly, if by December 2022 we can pay the whole thing back, we only need to pay $3/4, $30,000 back. That seemed to me to imply that if we can't do that, that we would probably have to pay the whole $40,000 over a certain amount of time, and there will be a certain interest rate. Has all that been articulated, or is that still fuzzy?
No, that has all been laid out in the government's program as well. So the bank is, your bank is administering that loan. So if you're not able to pay the full amount back, so the documents that you receive from the bank will say that this $40,000, 75% of it is due by December 31st, 2022. And if you're not able to meet that due date, then they will roll the full $40,000 into a loan at a particular interest rate, and the interest rate is fixed in the documents as well. I don't know if the rate was just below or right around 5%, and you have about 60 months to pay that money back.
Okay. So we've looked at, looking at the opportunities for individuals to get some help from government, and we've tied that a little bit into perhaps also equipping the deacons to encourage them to become aware of those programs. and then looked at small businesses and the opportunities that exist for them to take advantage of government programs. Before I go to my next question, I had a thought. You mentioned these carpenters who, one-man shows, who might not be a registered business, let's say. They probably also wouldn't qualify for the other program either, would they? If they, how would that work? Would they qualify?
My understanding is that they would not qualify for the $2,000 monthly income either, because they haven't really been laid off. They would be hard pressed to prove that they've, that COVID is causing their current financial situation. Now, I haven't worked through really the fine print of that $2,000 monthly income, but from a big picture sort of perspective, I don't think they would be eligible for the $2,000, and I know for sure they're not eligible for the $40,000 loan.
Okay, so there's a group of people that could really be challenged at a time like this.
Very much so, very much so. And that's also why it's important for the rest of the business community to take advantage of a $40,000 program like this, because we may be able to hire, we may have some plumbing work that needs to be done in our business, or we may have some carpentry work that needs to be done. And we might be a little bit afraid to spend money today because of COVID. Most businessmen are have really turned the taps right off as far as spending money goes. But this may be a way to help a small business like that, an independent plumber or an electrician or a carpenter, doesn't matter, but help them without giving them a handout. Because one of the concerns, of course, is from an emotional or a social perspective, if we create too many handouts, what does that do for our sense of self-worth, so to speak, right? So, but if we can phone the guy up and say, hey, are you doing anything? Have you got any work lined up? I need some work done in my office, or I need some work done in my manufacturing facility. You could use that $40,000 for that without being concerned at all about your other corporate cash, right? So.
Yeah. Okay, then I want to look at how do we prepare for these kinds of things again? So for most of us, we've never experienced anything like this before. Certainly our grandparents and our great-grandparents lived through the 1930s, lived through war. But for many of us now, we haven't experienced the challenges that we're experiencing now, and relatively, they look somewhat small relative to the experiences of our grandparents. But do you have any recommendations that you would make for us? I mean, they're talking, for example, that COVID-19 would resurge again in the fall, and maybe even worse. So who knows if we have another one of those economic downturns, and we have another government offering billions and trillions of dollars respectively. Any thoughts or advice that you would give to us as we don't live in that fear, but we live in anticipation or maybe in preparation for such a time as this?
So from a very global perspective, I would address that in this way. I think each home, each household, each head of a household, or each husband and wife should sit down and take a look at their personal household budget and their personal their personal possessions, and just see what do they really need to keep and what could be sold, what can we do without. Because I think that we don't realize how devastating this could still be, even if COVID doesn't have a second wave in the fall. We have, in my estimation, closing down business worldwide has a risk of doing massive systemic damage to the global economy and to business everywhere and how business will function. So business is going to have to change, and probably will have to change for quite some period of time. There will be a reduction of cash coming in, there will be a reduction of jobs available, and that will just cause all kinds of continued financial pressure as we work our way through this financial downturn, which we haven't even hardly seen the beginning of yet, in my estimation. So take a look and see what possessions you have, and do you really need them? The difficult question is, how do you get rid of stuff that you don't need? Because there won't be a lot of people out there who have money to buy it anyway. So it's going to be, that could be challenging, but that's where I would start. I would also be very, very careful about buying anything at this particular time. Every dollar that you spend, you should make sure that you're spending on something that you really need. So don't be spending any money on things that you can do without for the next foreseeable future. So be very, very careful. And I think there's a really big lesson in here for all of us, in that we think we all think we're pretty smart, and we all think that we can build a plan based on what we see today. So many of us took on more debt than we should have, because we bought a nicer home than we perhaps should have purchased. We have a debt on our vehicles. We have debt on some of our recreation vehicles. All of these things should cause us to reflect on who were we really serving when we took on this debt. The Bible has some pretty strong words to say about debt, and it may be advantageous for all of us to just do a review on what does the Bible say about debt. It makes some strong statement about how the person who borrows is a slave to the lender, and if you offset that with how God sent his son to die to free us from slavery. Now, I understand that the freedom that we have been given through the death of Jesus is a freedom from the slavery to sin, but there is a relationship between the slavery to sin and the slavery to debt that sometimes we don't really want to deal with in our world, because we think that we maybe have a plan. We can afford it. We can make the payments. And now COVID comes along and we find out that we have a problem. We have a serious problem. So we're probably not really answering your question very well, because how do we deal with the next wave of COVID? I really don't know if there is a second wave. I really don't know, Chris. I think just be really, really careful with every dollar that we spend. Encourage all of our organizations, all of our small business owners to be very careful about what they spend. And listen well, I'm not suggesting that we need to go through the next number of years in panic or in fear. We need to continue to trust God, because God will provide, but we really need to reflect carefully on what God is perhaps messaging to us by way of this pandemic.
So two thoughts. If we have that previous discussion about taking advantage and giving work to somebody who might not have enough, or perhaps one of our church members owns a restaurant or a coffee shop. I don't need to buy coffee at the coffee shop, but if I buy coffee at the coffee shop, I'm helping my brother or the economy more in general. So if we apply the only spend on your fundamental needs approach on a broad scale, wouldn't that, in a sense, create this tension between trying to get the economy going versus taking care of ourselves?
It very much does create that tension, and we're aware in our office on a daily basis of that tension. So and we struggle with that tension, and we should. I think that's a struggle that God requires of us all the time. That's a tension that should be there. We should always be asking every time we spend a dollar, am I spending this dollar in a godly way? Every time we take action, we should ask ourselves, is this really what God requires, or is this what John wants to do? Is this about John, or is this about God's glory? So yes, there is, very obviously, there is a tension. You're absolutely right. But there's that tension should always be there. Yep. That's the reality when we live in this broken world. There is a tension between what does God require and what is Satan tempting us to do. Satan is tempting us to either have God, the government as our God, or before COVID, money was our God. That's the tension, right? Who is your God? Who does control my life? And I better be careful and choose my words carefully, but I recognize full well that only God can see my heart. You can't see what lives in my heart. But the flip side of that is also true. Not only is God the only one who can see my heart, but God will check my heart. He is watching my motivation. So the tension is there, and now I can deal with that tension by testing my heart, testing the spirit. Am I trying to help Joe or Sally, who is a brother in the Lord or a sister in the Lord, or am I spending money for John's benefit?
Yep.
So yeah, that's a really good question. But I think in a big picture, that tension it should be there in all of our life every day, almost moment by moment, I would suggest.
So I think that's great. I think you're right, that maybe this brings us back to being more contemplative about our decisions, rather than thinking that money's always just going to be there and we can do what we like, which we never should have been doing in the first place. We should have always been carefully considering how we make good use of what God gives to us. And then the other question that came to my mind as you were discussing, taking on too much debt, etc. We come to a scenario like we're in now today, John, and if I lost my job, well, the government bails me out. You got a small business, you need some help, the government gives it to you. The government gives you 40 grand interest free for 2 years, a year and a half. And you know what? You can keep 10 of it. So to my way of thinking, it seems, John, the government's just going to be there and say, here you go, Chris. Oh, you got to declare bankruptcy, or that's okay. Or the government or the bank will defer my mortgage and I'll be fine. It seems to me the government is telling us, we got your back. So what's the risk, John? Why not spend and take on debt? Because the government's going to babysit us.
That same risk has always been there. That risk is always there. When Satan tempts us, what is he telling us? You want to trust God? Do you really want to suffer? Do you really want to do without, this nice home or this nice boat or this nice trailer? Just because, you think God doesn't really approve of that kind of expenditure? I've got government out here looking after you. I've got government bailing you out every time you need to. So who is really behind this bailout? Ultimately check my heart. And that's really that's the only way to deal with that. You're right. There's a huge temptation for each one of us to say, it's okay. It's okay. Government will help us. What have we done? We've made government into our God. What's the risk of that happening? If we really think in a big picture, and Chris, this is something that I absolutely do not understand, but I know that somehow governments are lending money to governments. They're creating money out of thin air. And if you create money somehow out of thin air, is there a risk that that whole financial balloon collapses? A huge risk. So we go another 2 years making government our God, making money our God. And now one day everything blows up. Now where are we going to go? Who are we going to turn to now? Who's going to help us now? Would we not be better off today, already today, when God is sending us a message, turn back to God. Stop trusting government. Stop trusting money. Trust God. Use the resources that God has given us in a godly way. That's what we should be doing. That's the message that should be coming through. And you know, as I'm thinking, you know, we've missed a small, maybe not a small, but we've missed a small part of our population in this whole discussion, because we have a group of seniors in our discussion who are also impacted. And I don't have the expertise to deal with the social ramifications, the emotional ramifications of what's going on with COVID for these people. But financially, they also have issues and concerns, but also responsibility. So most of us, as you know, as you well know, Chris, I've just joined the illustrious ranks of being a senior earlier this month. I'm now on a fixed income as well. So what does that mean? What do I do as a senior citizen with my financial resources, and what am I doing to ensure that those financial resources are being used in a godly way as well? So I think that cohort also needs to find ways to use their financial resources in a godly way. Many of us over our life here in Canada have been very richly blessed, and you know, what are we doing with those financial resources during this COVID time? Are we using those resources to help Christian schools, to help the theological college, to help the teachers college, to help Reform Perspective, to help Asian Mission? You know, I can go on and on. Are we using them for that, or are we just piling things up so we have something to pass on to our kids and grandkids?
Yeah. No, you're right to mention the seniors indeed, because they have that fixed income, and often they have also that stability of their finances in the sense that they don't carry on that debt like a lot of young people are carrying right now. And indeed, I think being a younger person myself, relatively at least, life has been simple. And anytime you needed money, it was there. If it wasn't from mom and dad, it was from the bank that gave you a student loan. It was from the bank that gave you a car loan or wherever. You have your lines of credit. So I think the temptation for younger people is to think that it's always just going to be there. We don't need to worry about it. And the older generation has been, you know, they grew up through certain challenges where they've paid off their debt. You know, and I look at the younger generation, John, and you know, to buy a house in Canada is significant debt. It's a challenge, and I think if you live in Ontario and you have a Christian education there, it's significant every month. Again, how much has to go to the schools to maintain those? So, in my own mind, I think about my own debt, and I think, you know, John, I think you're right. I need to really consider what debt I've taken on to myself. You know what? We are slaves of Christ, right? And that is where we should be focusing all of our attention. But if I'm also a slave to the money lender, as it were, then my attention is split, right? Now, I think there's a case, of course, where we don't really have a choice to have a mortgage today. You're going to have a mortgage. But do I need to have debt in other scenarios? I think we need to be really careful for that. John, is there anything else that you want to conclude with any thoughts that you have about where we are today and how we can respond to this in a Christian, godly, and a stewardly way?
I think that the only thing that I would really the only comment that I would like to add is that we should all keep in mind that conversations like this should continue not just between you and I, but also between you and your deacons, between deacons and other deacons, amongst business people. Just because I have a certain perspective on how to deal with financial resources doesn't make my perspective, first of all, it doesn't make it right. But secondly, there may be other things that we can learn from each other. So we need to take advantage of this opportunity to communicate more with each other, to help each other, to find biblical, godly solutions, but be patient with each other. Just because I think it's okay to take a $40,000 loan, but if you were a business owner and you say, John, I can't see myself doing that. I can't see that it's right. We can both take a look at this and come to two different conclusions. And as long as we're able and willing to continue to have that discussion, that's really the key. Discuss in a godly way, and then try to find solutions for God's glory, not because John thinks he's right or Chris thinks he's right or, the businessman up the street. There can be three different ways to get to the same endpoint that doesn't make any of those roads the wrong road. It just means that they're different. And let's try to be patient with each other as we work through a time that none of us, even the most elderly amongst us, they've lived through the Second World War, but very, very few people still remember what it was like to live through the 1930s. That was a difficult time. So help each other through this, I think, Chris.
No, I appreciate that, John. And I think you're right to highlight that there's the biblical principle of godly stewardship, and that's the foundational principle. Now, how do we apply that? We may disagree, right? And we can learn from each other, and iron sharpens iron. So we have a lot we can learn from each other. And your other point earlier that, we don't even know the impact of the impact on the economy. It's just starting, which means that we have time to discuss, and things will change, and maybe our opinions will change. But in the meantime, let's have that discussion together and grow together. Hey, John, thanks so much for your time today. And hopefully the things we shared today give people some food for thought as they consider how best to use the resources God gave to them. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Chris.